The police would stop occasionally and grab any Mexican-looking individual and throw them into one of the trucks if they lacked identification. Later in life, when I recalled the incident, I realized the police weren't distinguishing between citizen and non-citizen. If you were a Mexican, you were gone. The miscalculation was that not all of these people were aliens. Some of these people were Americans. Constitutional rights that an American citizen should have, regardless of their ancestry. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero, and thank you so much for being with me today on my channel, where we've been delving into questions of American identity and really looking into the experience of these different ethnic groups who were getting folded into the melting pot of the United States. Today I'm going to tell you a story that took place in California. In the heart of Los Angeles' bustling Mexican community, a tranquil Sunday afternoon in La Placida Park was interrupted by a large group of armed undercover agents. They methodically cordoned off the park. The unsettling memory of a particular episode during the Great Depression remains largely unexplored. Over 1 million people were forced back over the border into Mexico under the guise of repatriation, but in reality, nearly 60% of these individuals were actually American citizens of Mexican descent. This sweeping campaign was not an isolated incident, but rather a systematic operation involving federal, state, and local governments, as well as major industries. But the inevitable question arises, why were these people targeted and sent out of the country? Well, the answer lies beyond just the economic fallout of the Great Depression, although that played a huge role. But there was a larger backdrop of this prevalent xenophobia that was kind of taking root here in the United States. And we talked a lot on this channel about some of the laws that were passed and immigration regulations that were passed around this time as well. Mexicans, who were the latest wave of immigrants in the early 20th century, were singled out as scapegoats by the American public. Now, while there was no federal deportation act of Mexicans or Mexican Americans, Attorney General William Dill, during the Hoover administration, launched a deportation program, a solution for the high unemployment that was happening during the Great Depression. So we won't go into deep into the history of the Great Depression, but what's relevant to this is that people didn't have jobs. There's not a lot of opportunity for work, and people were kind of looking for someone to blame, and they decided, okay, there's too many Mexicans here. So if we just had the Mexicans gone, then people would have jobs and we would be okay again. So this ignited an atmosphere of fear among the Mexican community. And we're not just talking about Mexican immigrants. We're talking about people who have Mexican ancestry but were born here. They were citizens of the United States. Simultaneously, big players like U.S. Steel, Ford, and Southern Pacific Railroad persuaded their Mexican employees to return to their homeland. Local governments joined in and reduced the relief costs by driving Mexican families out of the country. So, some of these families, they felt like we're taking too much from the other people in the country. So I thought, well, if we can get these people over the border, then there's more for the rest of us. But unfortunately, the miscalculation was that not all of these people were aliens. Some of these people were Americans. It was a so-called voluntary repatriation. The nature of these deportations is still contentious, to say the least. County agents would deliver train tickets to families. So, think about that for a second, to have an agent show up to your door and give you a train ticket and say, hey, this is your ticket to leave. Even if it was not a legal a law that had been passed, you're going to feel pressure to leave. And the agents would say, hey, you'll be far better off in Mexico, so you should take this train out of here and head to Mexico. Federal raids and intimidating visits further undermine this voluntary departure nature. So the argument is it's voluntary, people left of their own accord, which some did, but we have to take a step back and say, okay, was it voluntary or was it voluntary? Now, the Placida raid, which we talked about at the beginning of this video, happened in February of 1931. So right in the middle of the Great Depression here. And it was particularly notorious. So even though the number of deportations from this raid was not overwhelming, the sheer fear that it induced in the Mexican-American community was substantial. This raid, coupled with relentless newspaper coverage, plunged the Mexican American community into constant dread, forcing them to live in the shadows. Now, officially, the programs were just supposed to target undocumented Mexicans. However, the public sentiment was largely in favor of driving all Mexicans away, regardless of their citizenship status. So whether they were naturalized or born here and just of Mexican descent, didn't matter. The goal was to have them all leave. Forced departures occurred not only in homes, but at workplaces, which were frequently targeted by raids. Believe it or not, the federal government decided to turn a blind eye to most of these activities. The Placida Park raid is an emblematic memory of this era, epitomizing the sense of terror that infiltrated the Mexican American communities. Despite presenting valid documents, people like Moises Gonzalez were detained, exemplifying the rampant disregard for rule of law. So there were individuals who had the documents that were required to say, hey, I'm naturalized, or hey, I was born here, but it didn't matter. A lot of these people would still be removed. And the raids left an indelible psychological scar on these Mexican American communities, making them feel like strangers in their own neighborhoods. And the impact, of course, was devastating, with families torn apart and a sense of belonging being snuffed out. There's other cases like Angela Hernandez de Sanchez, who was a longtime U.S. resident, who also faced deportation. It underscored the glaring discrimination and racial bias underpinning the deportations. It wasn't just about where you were born, what country you were a citizen of. It was about how you looked and what they assumed about you. One historian attributed these mass deportations to what she called, quote, racial expulsion. But were U.S. citizens, making their expulsion actually a banishment from their homeland of the United States. And I wanted to read a story that I found. It was a first-hand account, and her name was Emma Gomez. And so I'll put this up. It says, my family lived in Erie, and my father had taken me along to shop in Longmont. I think I was about 7 or 8, so it was about 1935 or 1936. I witnessed police escorting Mexican families out of Longmont in a caravan. The police would stop occasionally and grab any Mexican-looking individual and throw them into one of the trucks if they lacked identification. Later in life, when I recalled the incident, I realized the police weren't distinguishing between citizen and non-citizen. If you were a Mexican, you were gone. President Herbert Hoover's administration was the one that was in power while this was going on, even though he didn't explicitly endorse this. His administration had this racially coded slogan, which was, quote, American jobs for real Americans. Now, I'm okay with saying American jobs for Americans. I think that's fine. I think any country would say that. But adding that qualification of a real American is where we start going down this rabbit hole that we've been going down on this channel, which is trying to distinguish between having a hierarchy of who is more American than somebody else. And so to say, well, we're all American, but we're not equally American is a real problem. Herbert Hoover's Secretary of Labor, William Doak, actively supported local laws, though, and agreements that marginalized Mexican Americans from employment opportunities. This was a collaborative effort. And again, it wasn't just like there was a overarching law, like the immigration laws that had been passed that were keeping immigrants from Asian countries from coming over and keeping Italians from coming over. This was, it was a little bit more secretive, and from my understanding, from what I'm reading, it felt very, very expansive. When it's not just like federal law, but it's local government and it's businesses, and this whole goal of just kicking out as many Mexican Americans as possible. Economists studying the effect of the repatriation drives on cities argue that they actually didn't boost local economies as they were expected. Hoover, who was already blamed for the ongoing depression, lost the 1932 presidential election, and his successor, FDR, neither officially sanctioned nor suppressed the raid, so it's just kind of still happening as background noise. And they persisted until World War II, when the need for wartime labor led to the recruitment of temporary Mexican workers through the Bracero program. And in 2005, California passed the Apology Act for the 1930s Mexican repatriation program, which I feel like saying repatriation kind of makes it sound like they're doing you a favor. And that's not what this was. But they did officially apologize for the fundamental violation of basic civil liberties and constitutional rights that an American citizen should have, regardless of their ancestry. It also called for a commemorative plaque to be erected in Los Angeles. And finally, in 2013, so it's like 80 years later, California passed a law mandating the teaching of the repatriation drive history in public schools, which shed a light on an largely overlooked chapter of American history. It was really interesting. I was actually asking my husband if he knew about this because his family, his dad's side of the family, that side of the family came over from Mexico, I think in the like 1920s, 1930s, into California, but he had never heard about this. And so this was kind of a new history that we were learning. So, what's the takeaway here? Or my takeaway, I think, is this. I think actually it's phrased perfectly. Was Hoover's his little slogan for his thing is "real jobs for real Americans," and I think that gets at the heart of the problem is when we start qualifying who's really an American, because again, that creates a subset and that creates the division, and it's a division that we are still working through. So let me know if you knew about this, if this is something impacted your family, and what do you think about the phrase real Americans? And if you are interested in digging into your own family stories and want to learn how to share your own family stories, I just released a masterclass online. It's a workbook with videos to kind of guide you through that entire process. We do it together. So I'll leave a link for that below if you're interested. Otherwise, we'll talk soon.